For most countries, geopolitics are unforgiving. If you exist in harsh terrain or among harsh neighbors, you just don't have many options for managing your affairs. The Turks surged up the Danube, as their home territories were not nearly large or secure enough to guarantee their safety, and there were no other reasonable directions to go. The Iberians developed new transport technologies to open trade, as otherwise they would have been trapped in Europe's poor backwaters. The British had to have a navy because they lived on an island. Had they done otherwise, they would have fallen prey to any other naval power that could reach their shores. The United States is in many ways the exception that proves the rule. America's physical place in the world is not just benign, but empowering. With no hostile nations on its borders, no hostile entities capable of bringing mass invasion to its shores, in most countries, suspect leadership is often rewarded with national destruction. The United States is so huge and so far removed from the world and has such deep reserves of national power that highly questionable or even failed policies can lead to a second term. But just because the Americans don't need a plan and accidentally stumbled into superpowerhood doesn't mean that they have never had a plan. And when they do have a plan, good or bad, the world is remade. World War II was the most significant conflict in human history for any number of reasons. It was the first truly industrial conflict in that all of the players had fully internalized the whole host of industrial technologies. All the major combatants were fully industrialized, from the manufacture of machine guns and uniforms to the logistics of food distribution. Death was regularly dealt at ranges and in volumes on an entirely new scale. Even the low-end assessments for the war estimate 50 million dead. The war's most enduring legacy, however, wasn't its reach or its destructive capacity or the number of players involved, but the fact that one of those players had finally come of age. Because of American participation, the war's outcome was never in doubt. The surprise is not that the Allies won, but that the Axis held on for 3 years after raising America's ire. But as awesome as the sheer magnitude of the American war effort was in absolute terms, it paled in comparison to the United States' strategic position when the dust settled. At war's end, the Americans had forces on friendly terms in the United Kingdom, West Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Austria, and Norway. The European geographical advantage over the non-American world remained so huge that even in the ashes of the post-war devastation, the occupied Western European states still collectively represented 1/4 of global economic power. There was little industrial capacity outside of the United States. Not only had most of the world's industrial and consumption capacity been destroyed, but the war had been so destructive that it had taken as well the bulk of the imperial militaries. Only the Soviets still had an army, but bereft of naval transport, it was an army that was not deployable in a global sense. The Americans controlled the oceans. In mid-1939, the Americans had 178 surface combatants and 58 submarines in the water out of a total fleet of less than 400 vessels. At the war's final day, only 6 years later, the Americans had a 6,800-vessel navy with over 1,000 major surface and submarine combatants. The navies of every major naval combatant of every significant pre-war power had been relocated to the seabed. The United Kingdom was the sole exception, and it could no longer operate without assistance beyond European waters. For the first time since the onset of the Blue Water era in the early 16th century, there was only one navy on the oceans. It was the single greatest concentration of power that the world had ever seen. The question was what to do with the war gains. One obvious option was to absorb the Axis and Western European empires into itself and establish a Pax Americana over the global system. That's certainly what the occupied Europeans and the opposing Soviets expected. But direct global control just wasn't the American style. It wasn't so much a moral distinction as a practical one. Despite America's numerical superiority vis-a-vis every foe it had battled to date, occupation doesn't play to American strengths. A PAX requires long-term occupation of key distribution and gathering nodes, large-scale urban pacification, and in general making the occupied populations offer up a sizable chunk of their wealth and income to their occupiers. It means fighting a wide-ranging, manpower-heavy, low-intensity war of occupation. The Americans may have been numerous, but they were still maritime. Maritime powers favor highly mobile units that zip about, bringing superior firepower to discrete conflict zones, smashing foes and then flitting off before their adversaries can reposition their land-based forces. A long-term occupation would have parked U.S. detachments across the length and breadth of its new territories and compelled them to police local populations. Their mobility advantages would be surrendered. As of 1946, it was obvious that a Cold War with the Soviets was already underway. The Soviet military was not only numerically larger, but clear and extremely present across the bulk of northern Eurasia. In a Pax arrangement, the Americans would be draining money and resources from their occupied territories, so expecting Pax subjects to fight to maintain an American empire would have been a tough sell. That meant that the Americans wouldn't just need a few million men to keep the British and French and Italians and Germans and Dutch and Arabs and Persians and Indians and Indonesians and Taiwanese and Japanese and Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos in line, but that Washington would also need additional American forces in the millions to hold the defensive lines against the numerically superior Russian and Red Chinese forces. The Americans were powerful, but they just didn't have the numbers to occupy the bulk of the globe. With the Pax, the American peacetime army would have had to exceed wartime force levels. The Soviet-Russian military was built expressly for occupation. Russia has no geographic barriers at its borders. Gaining security comes from a simple two-pronged strategy: occupying everyone nearby to secure strategic buffers, and establishing an intrusive intelligence service to infiltrate the occupied populations in order to keep them docile. The same techniques used to occupy Ukraine and Armenia in Central Asia were already being applied with brutal success in 1946 to occupy Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria and Latvia. As of the late 1940s, it was apparent that while the Americans had come in first in the war, they simply lacked the staying power to hold onto their gains in the face of strident Russian challenges backed by more men, simpler supply chains, a higher tolerance for casualties, and a practiced, casual willingness to apply massive violence to civilian populations to achieve political ends. A direct American soldier for Soviet soldier face-off couldn't be won. What the Americans needed were not just allies to help carry the defense burden, but allies who were so eager that they would be willing to stand up against the awesome force of the Red Army. A Red Army that was still roused by the fact that it had single-handedly decimated the Nazi Wehrmacht at Stalingrad. It requires a hell of a bribe. And what the Americans came up with was one of the great strategic gambits in history. They assembled a plan, and then assembled their wartime allies on July 1, 1944, for a conference in New Hampshire to lay out their vision for the New World.